We met with Lorna at a DevRel community. There is a hidden corner in the internet where developer relations people hide, talk together, and discuss like their lives. And that's where we met. And that's where I talked Lorna into actually coming here and sharing her experience with you all. And she's doing that after 2 hours on another call. So she deserves, if not a clap, then at least a nod. Like, yes, yes. Thank you for doing that, Lorna.
It's not exactly a hardship, and the previous call was also about OpenAPI. So, I just, what can I say? I just enjoy this stuff. I think it's important. So hopefully you see my slides. And I want to share with you today how much I love APIs. So this is like HTTP APIs, web APIs, and kind of, I'm a developer advocate. I work for a company called Vonage. You might also know us as Nexmo. I'm so confused by the rebrand, I didn't even manage to get the company name on the slide this time. And I think your API and the documentation of your API is a huge influence in your developer experience. And a really big thing that you can do to improve things there is have great documentation. And the way that we have great documentation is we use an API description language. Now, there are some choices. API Blueprint has been around. If you've seen MuleSoft, they use YAML, but they also support OpenAPI. There's also a standard called OpenAPI. It's an open standard, meaning lots of nice open source tooling. And it's OpenAPI that I'm going to focus on today. If you've previously seen things called a Swagger, this is like the today version of that. So some of the tooling from SmartBear still has Swagger in the name, but OpenAPI is the way that we describe that. We described that today. The API description language is, if you've ever used a SOAP service and first you get a WSDL and you feed it to your code, this is like that. It helps the machines to understand your API. It describes it in enormous detail. I think it's a great fit for this audience because although you have DevRel in the title and I don't have DevRel on my slide, I feel like DevRel, I live in the middle of this somewhere. The people who are really good assets to creating a great API description are all three of the people here. So the product owner, they know the product in such enormous detail that they can give insight that I don't think anyone else alive can give you when we're talking about particularly a customer-facing product. The engineers, right, because they're right down in the technology, they can tell us all about the validation rules and the finer points of the data types, and that's important. I also think the writers bring something very magical when they're involved in writing API specs. Working with API descriptions, there's a lot of very short descriptions, very concise. It's basically microcopy. There are example values which themselves can tell a story if they're used really well. So if you identify as any one of these three, and especially if you have one with a tendency for another, like I'm an engineer with a writing problem, then having you involved in an OpenAPI spec project, it will make magic. I think it's just incredible. It also means if you build the spec before the API, and you can do it either way around, you can involve all of your stakeholders in discussing how the API should look, how it should behave. You don't write some requirements, give them to engineering and hope. You bring everybody to the table. You can generate the documentation immediately before the API is built. Everybody can understand the docs and look at them and discuss them. As an engineer, I'll often also put up a mock server from that description. The API doesn't exist. But with the description, with the OpenAPI spec, I can run a mock server, I can poke at it with curl, I can get a feel for how this is going to work, what the experience is going to be like. This sounds magical, but how does this even work? Okay, straight up warning, there is YAML coming. right? This stuff is not rocket science, but it is verbose and it is unwieldy. For this example, I'm going to show you the Nexmo Vonage Number Insight API. It's an API that lets you give a phone number and get some information back about it, and you can get more levels of detail and they cost more money. It's quite simple. So here are the first, 12 lines of the OpenAPI spec. This section is mostly metadata. It's not required. Some tools won't even render it. Take my advice. Don't skimp on this section. The API document is not just for generating API reference, it's also for making your API discoverable. We'll be publishing these specs to catalogs. People will be searching by keyword. They'll be looking to use these fields. So make sure that you have taken the time to complete it. That's my top tip. After this section, there's a section called paths, and that describes all the different kind of endpoints. This is what you would think of as detailed API documentation. It shows you all the paths. It shows you the verbs that you can use with each of those different endpoints. And then I've taken all the detail out in this screenshot because it's, I don't know, 800 lines or something. But it describes all the parameters, what they're called, what their format is, what any required fields, and the responses. If you get a 200 response, how does that look? If there's an error, what will the status codes be? How will the payload look? Lots and lots of detail, lots and lots of examples. OpenAPI also has the ability to reference another part of the spec. So you can, in the top section here, I've got a parameter. It's the format parameter. Every endpoint in this spec uses the format parameter. I don't want to define it everywhere it's used. Instead, we can put it in the components section and just refer to it everywhere we need it. We can also refer to things defined in other files. So this can help to keep things manageable. It can help you to split your spec between files, make it easier to render, and move things around. It's magic. It's so much. It's incredible. So hooray, OpenAPI. I think the effort for creating an API description versus creating detailed, human readable, but also human created documentation in restricted text or markdown or something, they're about even. But once you've got the API description, there are a bunch of advantages. First and foremost, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but it is text-based. You can stick this thing in GitHub and very easily see what changes. So if a field is added to your API, it's immediately obvious that's what happened. And the spec will change. You can see the change really easily. Yes, I just told a room full of technical people to use source control. I'm not sorry. People get anxious about working with the specs, and I have kind of two main options that I would direct you to when you want to start working with OpenAPI. One is just use your editor. You're brilliant with your editor. You use it all the time. Make sure that you've got an OpenAPI plugin, or at least some sort of YAML syntax highlight. That'll help keep things valid. And there are lots of validators and style guide tools around to help you. I find code folding really useful, so make sure you get that as well. If wrangling raw YAML is not your thing, then you're making a valid point. And there are some specialist tools that give you a much nicer interface. So this is a screenshot from Stoplight Studio, which is available both as a desktop application and as a web application. And it just presents you can see it here, like forms to fill in, what fields does it have, it has this, 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 and it shows you can see a preview of the rendered spec as documentation, or you can see the preview of the YAML output as I have it here. Validation is built in, mock server is built in. Both of those are also open source tools. We use them standalone in our CI build as well, and it's really nice that those are all the same tools as well. So you've wrangled a load of YAML, you've described your API, even the machines can understand every aspect of your API. So now what? Well, you can generate documentation. There's, again, a bunch of tools. The most commonly used is Redoc. I love generated documentation, it really separates the presentation from the content, and the content is the API description. Redoc is very scalable. It's very standard. I have seen a bunch of sites that I have been surprised to learn that they were Redoc. So I find this is a really good example. You can generate all kinds of different output as well. We have one where it's a really closed API, only available to a few people, and we generate a nice PDF from the description for that, and we give it to them in their welcome pack. You could also, for example, generate just the endpoints and a quick reminder of the parameters and not all the detail if you wanted to. And that's a real power. Here's the current API docs. With Nexmo, we just rebranded to Vonage. The rebrand was easy. I didn't do anything. Somebody who cares about front end fixed all my styles. One final trick I want to share with you is when you've got your API description, you can import it into your favorite HTTP client. For me, that's Postman. It gives you a ready-made collection, so you can go ahead and import the spec and immediately make API calls by just filling in the details. I think there's amazing stuff going on. I love that it's an open standard, and I think it'll change the way that we invite developers to use our APIs forever. I will flip to my resources slide briefly, and of course I'll share my slides later. But thanks for your attention.
I don't know. It's like, since I don't do anything of this normally, like it feels like magic.
Yeah, it is.
Felix, you have done something similar recently. So how does it sound to you?
I looked at OpenAPI API, and it is really cool for web APIs.
Yes.
It's a different world. What I was always wondering with web APIs, do you have the same problem? We have this versioning, so we have different teams on different versions of our product, so they need different API documentation.
Not so much. So we typically don't publish many versions. We just live with what we have in many ways, or things get added. There'll be additional optional fields or additional endpoints. So then a new version of the documentation will also cover earlier versions of the spec. So as long as we're not making breaking changes, that's not really a problem, because all users will hit the current version. But it means that we can't ever make a breaking change. We have a few where we have published a spec for version 1 and a spec for version 2. And sometimes we link between them if we need to, where usually it's just we did something really different. So that's in V2 and all the rest just works the same. But I agree. I think API versioning is a big problem, and this doesn't really solve that problem at all. Breaking changes.
And the second problem we normally have is who writes the API documentation, because developers do not like to write documentation.
So it's been an interesting one for us, and it's very much a team effort, which is why I had a gaggle of different people on my diagram. In theory, it comes from product before the engineers get started. And in practice, DevRel do quite a lot of the heavy lifting on this because we're the developer experience experts. We're also the API design experts in lots of ways. We're not specialists. I guess our engineers are specialists in the various tech stacks that they use, but we're specialists in gluing things together and making things approachable for developers. So it tends to be that DevRel get involved pretty early. And I think as we drive more adoption internally, I'm working on a lot of internal education around OpenAPI to kind of enable more people. I hope to see that change. But yeah, having tech writers on staff that are not afraid to get in here and improve those little descriptive sentences has just made this, I think it's improved our quality incredibly.
And my last question is, where do you store your API docs? Is it in the same repository as your source code for your application, or are they separate?
The API specifications are in a separate public GitHub repo, and they are consumed as a submodule by the other public documentation repo. So they're not kept with the product stuff at all. And that can affect how easy it is to keep in step, but we don't publish our product code and we do publish our specs. So we just have them available all the time.
Okay, thanks.
And we have a question about from Ruby Tuesday about IPA the Docs conference. Did anybody attend it?
I did. One of them. I've been to a couple of API the Docs conferences. One of them, if you check, there is a recording of a really earlier version of this talk. And this year I went to the one in Amsterdam, and it was really good. So look out for it.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I think, Lorna, your presentation, your talk was really, really great. It's so intriguing. It's like, so intrigued by a few points. I really love them. Like, use the same editor, so you don't have to move to another place to start another tooling, and that's really attractive. I have a question regarding the review process. How do you coordinate the review between different stakeholders, like tech writers and programmers?
So what we have is, and you can check all this out on our repo. I'll try to share a link. It's Nexmo/API specifications on GitHub. When we open a pull request, it runs a load of validation and style checking, and then it builds a preview. So you get a little. We have our own open source tooling that does documentation rendering that you've just seen a screenshot of, and it builds that when we open the pull request. So that's an easy way for, if like an engineer, or usually me, has made the change, then I can put it in front of, I can preview to support, to pre-sales. The product people will work with the spec, but it's easy for me to put a link. Click on this and like read this thing and tell me if it's okay. So that's, having the extra tooling, I think, has really helped as well, because we've got that rendered version, and we can just share a link around the business for anyone who needs to look at it, can look at it, and the engineers can grab it and play with it if they want to look at it in more detail.
We have something similar. We have in our GitHub pull requests our developers create. Before they merge it, they can press a button, generate documentation, and they get the API documentation for their branch to see if that looks correct before they merge it.
Oh, that's super nice. Yeah, I really value that kind of thing, and having the automation on pull requests is making it all easier, right?
Wow, that sounds really convenient.
It's nice. I feel so irrelevant to this conversation with lots of people much more clever than I around. I'm blessed. I actually have a question.
One more question.
Yeah, you go first.
You mentioned a hidden corner on the internet where the DevRel people meet. I would like to know that one.
I think I invited you before. Let me. So I think it's DevRel collective.fun. Yes. So it is basically Slack, and for advocates, community managers, and evangelists, with a developer word coming in front of all three of that. And it is a Slack, like you request an invite, and like there is a process involved, but you are qualified. If there is something like, if there is a struggle, just poke me. You're in anyway. The question I had, what was, yes, the question I had. So here's the question I had. Just before we started streaming, I talked about thinking of branding and packaging this this panel or this meetup as your API is your advocate or your evangelist. And just before, like, I think last week, the Singaporean DevRel group, DevRel folks, I think they're called. Sorry for, I will Google them up and put on the screen. Had a question about like how do you be a developer advocate when everybody's at home? You cannot go to the conferences and everybody starts streaming like just us. Hello. And there's like everybody's streaming, and now everybody's fighting for the eye. So what do you do? What I suggested to do is like, I mean, people still work and do their daily stuff, and they still Google stuff. What if you SEO optimize your documentation to be Googleable? What if your API reference is actually your developer advocate? What if you focus on your documentation so it does the good job for promoting your software, making sure your software or API or SDK is great. And I understand that developer relations has not only developer part, but also relations part, and that's super important. But we sit at home, or stand at home, or lie at home, but like still at home. So my long question with such a huge context is, do you believe in this crazy idea that while we cannot travel and build relations, we can use our own documentation to build these relations with people using our software, our SDKs?
Yeah, I really do. And honestly, it's not that different for us. My contract says that I don't travel at all, even though my title is developer advocate. I've always been more of a writer than a speaker. I've always done a lot of digital events. At Nexmo, we have writers and engineers, educators who all work on that written content so that we can reach the developer who is Googling us today, not the one that can reach the expensive Western conference that we're all at. I mean, them as well, hopefully, if they were home long enough to Google something. But I've always felt that digital presence is important. I've had a blog for many years, and content really is king. Perhaps more obviously today, when we're not flying around the world and collecting free T-shirts. But I honestly don't think a lot has changed. The value is still in the content, however it's presented.
Choco, do you have anything to add? Since I've just pitched you as a well, whatever you're doing, as a great opportunity for this crazy times. Suddenly, you're not just the writer; you're also the evangelist.
An evangelist for tech writers.
That also, because you actually host an event.
Yes. I mean, I see myself as an advocate for users, like end users, consumers, and advocate for tech writers. That's why I asked you the question about the review process. Actually, I love your points, the many points that in your presentation, in your talk. I mean, it's really similar to other technical writing style, or the types. For example, you mentioned the content is the king, right? I mean, that's true, so true. And especially you also mentioned Googling, because we write content for actually search engine optimization. We need to have our results appear in the top of the ranking. And then many other things like searchability, you want your developers who are users of your APIs to be able to find your APIs really quick. So I see many common in tech writing. I mean the regular tech writing type, if you may, and the API writing here.
Yep. Felix.
That's why I felt a little bit excited. So intrigued.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of common ground, and I think there's also a lot to learn from one another. I don't identify as a writer really, although I've written some books, so how qualified do you need to be? But whenever I go to write, there's a local Write the Docs meetup here, or something like API the Docs, I feel like I learn so much, and it's because we have so much to share.
Exactly.
It's the same every time I write something and ask feedback from our technical writer. It's like, oh, there's so much things you can improve, and vice versa. It is close together, but slightly separate, and then it's even more important to talk with each other.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
it's a big community.
I mean, that's that's what I mean. Shame on me. But 10 years in now 11, but 10 years after I have been into developer relations, I figured out that actually going to developer relations meetups makes sense, and it actually saves lots of time and effort to do it all right. And I mean, looking back, it's stupid that I didn't see a value in that, and I was invited to different conferences, and I was like, hey, I mean, I'm cool, I work in developer relations, what do we have in common with people promoting whatever, some SDK or working on some banking tool? I'm cooler. No, I was wrong. No, Like, shame on me. And then I went to Right Up meetup here in Stockholm, and I'm sitting in the room, and like, people, you are solving the problems that I'm solving. We should work together. We should work together. And that's one of the reasons why this meetup is happening. That people who are like me, who didn't believe into that, now, well, hear the message. And